Hi, Jim. Thank you so much for coming on today. We're super excited to have you. I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Okay. Well, my name is Jim Marshall, and I am the discoverer of hitherto unknown natural phenomena, which greatly aid in the understanding of people, from which I created a revolutionary practical philosophic system called Septemics, which is published in the book Septemics, Hierarchies of Human Phenomena. As for my qualifications, I'm a polymathic intellectual whose areas of expertise include psychology, philosophy, theology, parapsychology, science, engineering, mathematics, law, literature, history, metaphysics, military science, political science, physical culture, education, organization, and music. And I hold a Bachelor of Science cum laude from City University of New York.
Amazing. What is your book about?
Well, Septemics is a philosophical science based on the fact that many human phenomena occur in a sequence of 7 levels. Literally, the word septemics means of or pertaining to 7. Septemics comprises a collection of scales or sequences, each of which breaks down various human phenomena into a hierarchy of 7 steps. There are 35 such scales which span the spectrum of human experience, by which I mean any situation that arises in the life of a human will successfully be analyzed by one or more of the scales in this book. It's universally applicable. 24 of the scales apply primarily to individuals, and 11 apply primarily to groups.
How is Septemics beneficial?
Well, I wrote this book to help people. I had a long career as human development engineer, and I've gone from helping people by the hundreds to helping people by the millions by publishing this book. Each of the 35 scales provides the user with an infallible way of determining the salutariness or beneficialness of any group activity or person. If the group, individual, or activity moves persons or groups up the scales, it's beneficial or positive. If it moves them down, it's detrimental or negative. More importantly, just finding out what level you or another person or some group is at is by itself enlightening and beneficial. And finally, once you know the actual level or person or level of a person or group on any scale, you can improve that person by moving them up one level at a time. All of these advantages represent major steps forward for society. Each of these scales is an axis against which to evaluate human behavior, and combined, they empower one to understand, predict, and manage human affairs to a degree hitherto unattainable by most.
Does it apply to everyone?
Absolutely. It goes across every demographic that you can think of. The scales apply to people regardless of gender, race, history, ethnicity, society, religion, culture, economics, education, profession, geography, national. These scales transcend any other categories of people. And I've been working with them for 27 years, so I've seen this work.
I'm curious, could you give us a more behind the scenes peek and tell us about one of the scales?
Sure. The first scale that I discovered as a septemic scale is what I now call the scale of basic purposes. I did not know until much later that it was a scale of basic purposes. In other words, I had the scale, but I didn't know the axis. And in each case of the 35 scales, I first found the scale, and then I had to figure out what axis this was measuring, which is a separate thing, and that took a lot of research. So this scale, originally I had a 6-level scale, which I absolutely knew was correct. I had been using it for decades, which I had discovered empirically. And in 1995, I discovered it had a 7th level. And when I inserted that 7th level into the 6th-level scale, it manifested mathematically. And as is the case with all mathematical functions, all kinds of implications jumped out, and I realized I was dealing with natural law. This is the most important because this scale is a trait which in most cases does not change over a person's life. Most people have one basic purpose for an entire life. Now, of course, everyone has thousands of purposes, but underneath all of those is the basic purpose. It's extremely important and valuable to know your own basic purpose or another's. For example, I know the basic purpose of every president of the United States, going back as far as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and many of the presidents prior to that who I studied, like Lincoln, Grant, Washington, and Jefferson. When you know somebody's basic purpose, that tells you an awful lot about them. You know what the person is trying to do. And I can't think of any other single thing more important to know than that. So, since this is a persistent trait, I would recommend everyone find your level on this scale. When you do, it will clarify your life greatly, because the other 6 levels you just throw out, they're not for you, they're for other people. And so it makes your life very clear, which helps in everything you do. You know what you're about.
Does your book walk through finding your level where you're at personally then?
Well, there's a lot of instruction in the introduction that tells you how to use the book. It's very specific. It tells you how to find your own level, and having found it, how to move yourself up on any one of these 35 scales. And then it also tells you how to find another person's level and how to help that person move up. Now, one of the basic rules of this, which I never violate, is never tell anyone his level on a scale. It doesn't help. Let him figure it out. Now, the good news is I did all the heavy lifting, and these scales wrap around the reader, meaning when you look at it, you get it. I'll tell you a story. 20 years ago, and when I was working on this book in the early stages, I had it in a transcript form. I was talking to a friend of mine about politics and government. And I said, wait a minute, let me show you something. And I opened the book to the scale of government, and I just handed it to him. I didn't say anything. So he took it, he looked at it for a couple of seconds, and he pointed. He said, I'm right there. He found his level without even telling him that there was such a thing as finding a level. That's how easy this works. He found his level. Now, I already knew his level because I knew the scale and I knew the guy. But I didn't tell him. I let him find it himself. You see, that's the power of this thing. Because then a person has an epiphany. He says, yes, I see. And everything starts to come into focus. So there are 35 axes. If you like, I can read you the names of the 35 scales, and that will tell you the subject matter that's covered in the book.
Sure, that would be amazing.
Like that?
Yes.
Okay, this doesn't take long. So there are 24 individual scales and 11 group scales. So these are the individual scales. The scale of basic purposes, the scale of personal influence, the scale of choice, the scale of permeation, the scale of thought, the scale of identity, the scale of evaluation, the scale of motivation, the scale of control, the scale of stopping, the scale of scholarship, the scale of literacy, the scale of human ability, the scale of memory, the scale of the scale of spiritual identity, the scale of mental deletion, the scale of aberration, the scale of physical fitness, the scale of justification, the scale of belief, the scale of equanimity, the scale of attack, the scale of conflict, and the scale of reaction. And the group scales are the scale of relationships, the scale of life spheres, the scale of government, the scale of civilization, the scale of survival, the scale of management, the scale of exchange, the scale of communication, the scale of allegiance, the scale of sexuality, and the scale of politics. Each one of these 35 scales is unique. You cannot infer anything about scale A from scale B. You cannot infer anything about scale C from scale D. And that's good news because each one of them is unique. It covers, with overlap, all the aspects of human phenomena, which is why this is universally applicable. So just off the top of my head, let's say a guy has relationship problems, right? That's a common problem. There's a scale of relationships. He could look at it and say, okay, I can see our relationship is here, level 5. And you see, when he knows that, then he can move it to 4 because it's specific. And he can say, well, there's a scale of permeation. Permeation is what causes love. When two beings are permeating one another, there's love there. So he could find his level on the scale of permeation. Where's my level? Where's her level? There's a scale of sexuality. If you're not compatible with your mate on the scale of sexuality, it's not going to work. Now, you don't have to be at the same level, but you have to be at a compatible level. And if you're not, you could be the two most wonderful people in the world. You can be friends, but sexually, you're not going to match up. Okay? There's a scale of allegiance. When relationships deteriorate, it's always corresponding to a deterioration in allegiance. The deterioration in allegiance causes the deterioration of the relationship. So you can find where you are on that scale. It's extremely powerful information, that scale. And you can see how you can work your way back up and see how it deteriorated and get back up to where it was good. And you can see where the other person is too. So just off the top of my head, somebody who has relationship problems can get this book, look at those 4. I'm not saying those are the only 4 that apply, because it depends on the person. For example, there's a scale of communication. Well, if you're having relationship problems, you're having communication problems, guaranteed. That one scale alone will change your whole life. Because if you become a master of communication, you can really interface successfully with people, all kinds of people. And I'm not talking about manipulation. I'm talking about true communication. So, for example, Albert Speer was an architect, and Hitler loved him. He was like Hitler's son. And he had very good communication skills. He was a brilliant man. And he was able to actually defy Hitler a few times because he wasn't a sociopath like Hitler was. And so because of his communication skills, Hitler didn't have him killed the way he did anybody else who bothered him. So, Ronald Reagan was called the great communicator. And he was extremely successful because he communicated to people. There's a whole group of people called Reagan Democrats. It wasn't just Republicans who understood him. Democrats understood him too because he communicated well. So that could fit in your relationship situation too. So most situations that most people have, there are multiple scales that will apply. So you can look through the book and say, how does this apply? And you'll finally say, oh, I see, this applies. And the better you get at it, in other words, the more you use this, the more user-friendly it becomes because you become familiar with the scales, and you will be in situations where it'll just occur to you. You're having trouble with, let's say, your landlord. And you'll say, all right, I can see we have a conflict on the scale of such and such. So the subtitle of this book is Analysis, Prediction, and Management of Human Affairs. So each of these scales enables you to analyze and consequently predict and consequently manage human affairs. So for most people, they're going to be able to analyze, predict, and manage human affairs to a degree hitherto inconceivable to them. I'll give you an example. When Obama came on the scene, most of us had no idea who he was. He was only a senator for 2 years before he started running for president. Now, of course, the people in Illinois knew who he was. They had elected him. But I had no idea who he was, like most people. This was an obscure guy with a strange name. So I said, well, he's running for president. I better find out who this guy is. So I listened to him. I observed him. I was able to spot his basic purpose very easily. And then I knew what he was about. I'm not going to tell you what it was because it would be unethical for me to do that. But you can figure it out yourself. So that enabled me to know how to proceed, what I wanted to do with this guy. I had something meaningful that was accurate and that gave me insight into his personality.
Amazing. What inspired you to write the book?
Well, I don't know that inspiration is the right word. All of this was discovered empirically. I had a long and successful career as a human development engineer, working with hundreds of clients over many thousands of hours. And as an engineer, like all engineers, I'm only interested in two things: facts and results. I got results from my clients. Okay. They would come into the session with some dilemma or problem or upset, and we would address it and it would resolve. Okay. Now, as this was going on over the decades, I started to observe that my clients were improving in ways that were predictable to me. I never told that to anyone, but I made notes. So after a while, I got better and better at this, where a guy would come in, sometimes even before the session would start, and I would know what was going on with him and how it was going to resolve, which only made me better because I knew what question to ask, which was the genius of what I did. I used Socratic dialogue. If you've ever read the dialogues written by Plato, the Socratic dialogues, he would talk to the person, not tell him anything, but just discuss it with him and ask the right question and lead the person to a series of epiphanies. That's the whole point of the Socratic dialogues, all of them. And that's really what I did. The only thing that was different is I used biofeedback, which helped me tremendously, because if you know biofeedback, if you know how to work it, if you know how to read the information, it tells you an awful lot about what's going on. For example, if a person is upset, the meter will read one way. If a person is keeping a secret, it will read a different way. If a person has an evil purpose, it will read a third way. So there are distinct meter phenomena that correspond to mental phenomena. And once you know what those are, you know what you're looking for. So you can ask the person, did this upset you? Well, say yes. See, I already know from the meter. So what happened was I started noting these phenomena, and I started developing scales where, in other words, the guy would be at level A, and then he would improve to level B, or the guy would be at level B and it would improve to level C. So by about 95, after many years of this, I had about 32 scales, because of course, humans are complicated. There are many axes. One guy improves on one axis, another guy improves on another axis. Or one guy improves on one axis in one session and a different axis in another session. So I had all of these scales. Now, I told you before about the scale of basic purposes, which was the first one I discovered. When I saw that had mathematics embedded in it, I knew it was natural law, because anything that has mathematics embedded in it, like the Pythagorean theorem or the three laws of motion, is natural law. And coming from a heavy science, math, and engineering background, I knew that. So I then said, well, I wonder how many of these other scales are actually 7-level scales that haven't been developed all the way, because I wasn't developing anything. I was just helping my clients and making notes. And the only reason I made the notes is because that's how my mind works. When I observe something noteworthy, I make notes. I went to school for 28 years, and so that's how you get after a while. So I asked myself, I wonder, how many of these are 7-level scales? And because I knew what I was looking for, it was easy for me to develop these scales all into 7-level scales. And as each one went to 7th level, it manifested mathematically. And the more I researched this, the more mathematics was in it. Now, when you read the book, it's not like you're reading mathematics. I'm just telling you that's how I got to it. Mm-hmm. Because I took 26 semesters of math, and I loved every minute of it. Okay? So I think mathematics, and I could see the mathematics, and so I could see that this was natural law. And so because of that, I knew that it would help people. Like the Pythagorean theorem. People have been using that since Pythagoras propounded it 2,500 years ago. It always works. Okay. Once I learned it as a young person and I went forward in mathematics, every time I came up with the right triangle, I whipped it out and used it. Okay. And that's what mathematics is about, knowing how to manipulate the formulae and the equations. So I saw all this and I said, this can help people. I can help people by the thousands but if I could write this in a way that would make sense to people, the average person could use it to help his life. And so that became my mission.
So when you were writing your book, I know you talked about people across the board, an average person. Were you thinking of a specific demographic that this book is for?
Well, I always knew that it was for people who wanted to improve themselves. Now, some people might make the mistake of saying, well, everyone wants to improve himself, and I'm sorry, that's not true. There are psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists and crazy people and very ignorant people. You know, there are categories of people who are not interested in improving themselves. They're just not. They just want to have more money so they can have a nicer house, have a prettier girlfriend or what. They're not interested in self-improvement. So that sort of, I knew. And of course, the book is in English, so it's for people who can read English. Now, there are 1.5 billion people who can speak English. And I estimate that about 1 billion of them could read this book. And I also estimate that about half of the human race wants to improve oneself or one's life. So we're talking about something like 500 million people who would benefit from this book. Now, if you know anything about the nonfiction publishing world, if a book sells 10,000 copies, that's considered a success. Okay, now I have a public here of 500 million people. The hard part is this is a new subject. Getting anybody to pay attention to a new subject is very difficult because almost everyone is in a box. Most people are not aware they're in a box because that's their reality. It's like, I don't know if you know this, but it's a pretty well-established fact now that conservatives hang out with conservatives and talk to conservatives, and liberals hang out with liberals and talk to liberals. So they have different realities. Their sets of facts do not match. And we can say that about many things. Like somebody who's in the baseball world, there's a whole world of baseball. It's complicated. It's big. It's global now, So that's like a box that person is in. So the reason that I'm a polymath is that I have no recollection of a time in my life when I was not intensely interested in learning everything that's taught in every university. And that's just how I was. Not only was I a good student who won scholarships and was an honor student, but in between, I was reading books. I say, oh, Abe Lincoln. All right, I got to find out about him, And so I would learn these things. And so I was always going off on tangents about things. And like I learned about science. Well, okay, this Isaac Newton guy, he's an interesting guy. Then I would find out about him, you see. So I was always branching out. And so I got into all these subjects. Now, if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have discovered Septemics because it would have been outside of my box. You see, it would have been too big for me to comprehend. So in a way, without realizing it, I was trying to find Septemics my whole life. And I discovered it really by accident as a result of my career. But because of my educational background, I was able to see it for what it was, a new subject that would help people. And I spent a tremendous amount of time crafting it in a way that would make sense to the average person. For example, this scale of sexuality. Level 2 on that scale, it's a very high level. Most people never get to that level, is I call take it or leave it. Now, that's not a very graceful way of explaining it, but it communicates. So I had to do this. There are 235 scales. Each has 7 levels. There are 245 different levels, each of which had to be verified, it had to be investigated, and then it had to be expressed. So I decided to just call level 2 of the scale of sexuality, take it or leave it, because it explains it perfectly. Now, most people don't know about this, but there are people whose attitude about sex is, well, they can just take it or leave it. If they have it, it's fine. If they don't have it, that's fine too. That's a very liberating level to be at. Not many people get there, but that's what I called it, because I'm interested in reaching the reader. And I know I did that because I have 27 years. The first version of this book was written as December of 95, it's completed. And right away, I started giving it out to people and getting feedback. So there have been many rewrites and many things that I added into it. Like, for example, I added glossaries. There's a glossary not only in front of every chapter, but in front of the introduction itself, so that you really can understand. There's no ambiguity here. So, because my goal is to help people. I've been helping people my whole life. That's what I'm about. And so now I'm doing it with this book.
How long have you been writing, and what made you really sit down and write?
Write this particular book?
The particular book. Or
Okay.
in general, if you've been writing your whole life, that too.
Well, yeah, I was a serious scholar. I went to private schools. I got very high grades. Even the prep school I went into, you had to take a test to get into it. And the same thing with, the college. I went to an elite college. So it was not easy to get in. And so I was a very motivated student. You have to understand that at the age of 10, I was shocked to find out that there were kids who didn't like school. That was like a new concept to me. I loved school. Now, of course, I had some dopey teachers and some uncongenial teachers, but I just figured, well, after this semester, they'll be gone, and the next teacher I'll have, I'll like. And mostly I did like my teachers because I like smart people. I like learned people. And I especially like people who are going to teach me something. So I was writing and writing. And, when you're a student, you're writing one way or another. I've done a tremendous amount of tutoring. And in math, when I tutored math, I said, write everything down. Don't do it in your head. Even though you know what it is, write it out because it helps the process. So I'm a very literary person. I read a lot and I wrote a lot. And I wrote, for example, when I was 17, I was writing poetry in Latin for fun.
Oh, that's amazing.
So, my Latin teacher wanted to publish it, but I was just a 17-year-old kid. I said, nah, I was too shy. But that's sort of, how I was. So I did, a lot of things where it was necessary for me to write. Like, for example, I did a lot of legal work of my own, where I would, if somebody commits illegal actions or unlawful actions to me, I sue them. That's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to beat them up or threaten them or anything like that. You're supposed to sue, and you go to court, but you have to know a lot to do that. You have to write briefs. You have to write motions, So I did a lot of writing in my life. So by the time I got to writing this book, which I started writing in 95, I already knew how to write, especially nonfiction. Because, when you're, especially in college, you have to write papers.
So true.
And I was a very conscientious student. I wanted to do it right, and I wanted to get high grades, and I did. Nobody had to force me, I liked it. So it wasn't like I was trudging my way through it. Oh, I'll be glad when this is over. I was usually unhappy when the semester was over. I liked the teacher. I felt bad about losing my relationship with the teacher because these were smart people who were enlightening me in things. And so, you have to move on. Okay, you got your grade and you go on to the next semester. I had a math teacher once for 2 years. This guy was brilliant. I mean, he knew how to teach math. As a person, he was a horrible person. Horrible person. But he knew his math. So I just didn't pay attention to the personality traits he had. And I focused on the fact that this guy made me a mathematician. Before that, I was just a smart kid who liked that. Well, after this guy, I was a mathematician. I knew my way around math. So that's why I went into engineering, which is filled with math. You're building things, you're creating things, you're repairing things, but it's all mathematical and behind the scenes. And that's what this book is like. Behind the scenes, it's mathematical. Now, there are a couple of places in the book where there were some points that were inherently mathematical. And so I just explained them. As a math tutor, I had to explain math to people, and I was kind of good at that. So I just explained it to the reader in a simple way that he can grasp. And so, it is a textbook. So my advice to people who I talk to about this is study it the way you would study a text, any text, the chemistry text, the math text, the economics text. Start on page 1 and go through and make sure you understand everything before you turn the page. But with all the glossaries in there and the way I wrote it to make it user-friendly, it's not that hard. It's really just understanding the words. Like, for example, there's a scale of equanimity. Well, you might not know what equanimity is, but I define it. I tell you right there, that's what it means. So then you can look at the scale and see, okay, I can see how some people have more and some people have. Equanimity is extremely important in human beings. If you find a person who's low on that scale, stay away from him. This is the type of guy who will lose his temper and punch you in the nose. Okay? If you have equanimity, you don't do things like that.
Wow, that was very enlightening. I appreciate it. What was your schedule like when you were writing your book? Did you have anything in your writing space that you needed to help you stay focused?
Staying focused was never my problem. Even as a boy, I was a focused person. Even if I was watching TV, like I loved The Twilight Zone. When that show came on, I was focused. I mean, that was revolutionary for its time. And it was really good. I was young and it was really for adults, but I was smart enough to get it anyway. So focus was, kind of built into me. And being a student, a serious student, like, for example, when I was in prep school, one summer, I went to summer school to take more math. I mean, I took math every semester in prep school, but I went to summer school to take more math, you see? So I was obviously focused. I had no problem focusing on what was being taught to me or what was in the text. So that was not an issue for me. But as far as schedule, I was always a very busy person. You have to realize I had a career as a human development engineer, and I always had a lot of things. I worked as a management consultant. I worked as a holistic health practitioner. I had a lot of things going on, and I had a lot of work, and I liked my work. So I really didn't take vacations because I didn't want to vacate what I was doing. When you genuinely help people, there is a feeling of agape or caritas that you get from it that's very fulfilling. And in a variety of ways, that's what I was doing. I mean, I was an altar boy between the ages of 10 and 13. Well, at that age, that was my understanding of how you help. for 10, 11, that was what I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to have. I'll be an altar boy. So again, I didn't get any money for that. Nobody made me do that. That was just, I did it because I was contributing to something that I thought was good. So it was, I wrote when I had the time to write. I have always had kind of the mind where things would just occur to me, whether I was writing music or writing legal briefs or doing math, things would just come to me. And then I would say, okay, I better write this down. I'd make some notes. Mm-hmm. So I would have notes, and then I would go back to the computer and I would inculcate these things. For me, writing is largely an iterative process. I sort of have the idea that, okay, I got this idea. Let's say I'm going to write a term paper or a thesis. Okay, I know what it is. Okay, and so I'll just sort of blurt it out. Blah. Okay, then I have something down. And then I will go back and say, okay, I need to expand this and, and work on it iteratively. And that's how I did this book. Actually, for this particular book, because you have 35 scales, that's a good way to do it. So, some scales I would have done. Okay, this scale is done. But then I had other ones that still had to be researched because things would come to me. Like I mentioned, the scale of equanimity. What I call a scale of equanimity, I used to call the scale of maturity. Because if you look at the levels, they look like maturity. See, when a person has very little equanimity, we say he's immature, like a little kid. A little kid, if you say, no, you can't have another donut. You had one, he gets upset because he lacks equanimity. But we say he's immature. Of course he's immature. He's 3 years old. Now, when an adult acts that way, we say, this is an immature person, okay? And so, but then I realized, no, what this really is measuring is equanimity, which is a very important people. I mean, a very important concept. When Jesus was on the cross and said, Father, forgive them, that is the height of equanimity. These people were torturing him to death, and he wanted them to be forgiven. To a point where he not only thought it, he said it. So even if it's a myth, as some people believe, the story still stands. So I had the scale, you see, because I could see people at these levels, but it took me a long time to figure out that I was measuring equanimity. So I had the data, and then I had to correspond it to what it was measuring, because the axis is the thing you're measuring by these 7 levels. So that took quite a bit of work, figuring that out and getting it correct. Like the scale of basic purposes, I went through a few different names, and until I eventually, through a lot of research and insight, I realized, okay, we're dealing with the basic purpose of the person. And once you know that's most of what you need to know about a person. Like, for example, Hitler's basic purpose was the lowest of the 7, which is destruction. He was a destructive person. And if you study the man, he was destroying everything left and right. It wasn't just his enemies, it wasn't just the allies he was destructive to. That's normal. He was destroying his own army, his own people, his own country, his own interests. Pol Pot is another person who was at that same level. Inherently destructive. Charles Starkweather in 1957 murdered, I think, if I remember correctly, 12 people in 10 days. For no particular reason. He had no remorse. If you said, if you say, don't bother me, he would kill you. I mean, this was an inherently destructive person. So once you know that about a person, that tells you, stay away. His girlfriend was hanging around with him, and she went to prison for a long time for complicity in these murders, even though she maintained all along, not only didn't she kill anybody, she wasn't part of this. She was just his girlfriend. So whether or not you believe that is another story. Obviously, the jury didn't believe it. They thought, well, you could have gotten away. She said, well, if I ran away, he would have killed me. Well, maybe that's true. But anyway, the point is, she wasn't an inherently destructive person, but he was. Now, if she had this book, she would have said, whoa, he killed both of her parents and their baby. Okay? So that should have been enough for her to see this guy's destructive. Goodbye. Mm-hmm. And when I was young, I didn't have this data. This hadn't been invented yet. So I made the same stupid mistakes that everybody else makes. Now that does not happen because I can analyze a person usually in seconds against whatever scale is relevant. Depends on, like, for example, on the scale of literacy. I can listen to a guy talk for 10 seconds and I can spot him on the scale of literacy because I know the scale and I know what its indicators are. And if you study the chapter, you'll see there are definite indicators. People who are at a certain level of literacy communicate in a certain way. It's identifiable. So that's something that I can do easily, and anybody can do it if you get the book.
It's very interesting. What type of books did you grow up reading? Did you have a favorite?
Well, I was a natural born polymath because I think I said I was interested in everything. I wasn't, I had friends who were interested in only certain things. By the time I was in prep school, I had categories of friends. Like I had one set of friends who were like my math and science friends. And we would go to science and math lectures recreationally. Some of these guys had trouble passing English. Then I had other guys who were my literary friends. We would go to like ancient Greek plays, or we would talk about books, Then I had athlete friends, guys who were like on the football team. And they weren't interested. So I had to keep these groups. It was obvious to me that these people didn't like one another. Somehow I got along with all of them. When I was playing football, I was being a football player. I wasn't talking about the 3 laws of motion. So I had these categories of friends. And so I related to them in the things they were interested in and not the things they were not interested in, which gave me a very full life. Because, like I could be in a playing a football game in the afternoon, and that night I could go to see a play, a Chekhov play with one of my literary friends. So that's sort of just how I was. Actually, I didn't even think of myself as a polymath until late in life, because I sort of wasn't interested in that. I was interested in things external to me. I wasn't looking at myself until finally late in life from things. I had a few people who called me a Renaissance man, and I didn't say yes or no, but I sort of thought about it. And after a while, I realized that I was a polymath. So that's just how I was.
What would you tell someone just starting out with reading again?
Reading anything or reading this book?
Anything.
Reading anything? Okay. Well, if you look at the scale of literacy, it tells you how to become more literate. It's very specific. There's also the scale of scholarship, which tells you how to be a better student, which is closely related. Because if you can't read, you can't study. So I would say, as I explained, the biggest problem, and you have to understand how much work I did as a tutor, as a counselor, as a facilitator. The biggest problem with people is not knowing the words, or even worse than that, having a misconception about the word. sometimes I'd be working with a client and the person would say something that I could tell from what they said that they didn't know what that word meant. So I'd say, let's look up this word. And I wouldn't tell them, I just say, here, look at this definition. And they'd say, oh, I see, and then they would understand it and they would be able to express it more cogently and sensibly. But I have a great love to this day of listening to erudite people. Like I listen to lectures and interviews of people who have graduate degrees every day. Because, if you, like, for example, Ron Chernow. Ron Chernow is a brilliant writer. His books are like 1,000 pages each. I don't have time to sit down and read Grant, although I'm interested in Grant and I read a biography of him. But you could sit down for an hour in a good interview and really get a sense of his understanding of Grant. It's very enlightening. Mm-hmm. So I do that. That's my idea of fun.
I love that. What would you tell someone on the opposite end who's starting to write their own book?
Well, first of all, I would say, are we talking about fiction or nonfiction? Because those are very different animals. I mean, I've written fiction and I've written nonfiction. It's a different process. It's a different experience. For example, I wrote a lot of songs. Writing lyrics, it's almost like having a dream. It's very subjective. It's sort of like an aesthetic thing that goes on in your mind and in your feelings too. It's not strictly analytical. And so it just would come out. That's different from nonfiction. Nonfiction, you're trying to convey something. If you're trying to write a biography about something, you're trying to explain it the right way, in a way that is clear. So I would want to ask you, are we talking about fiction or nonfiction? Because I would give different advice.
We have listeners on both sides. So
I would say if we're talking about a book, or really even just an article, you have to have the idea in your mind. In other words, what is your thesis? I've studied many great writers and listened to them speak about it, and they all say that they get an idea. I think it was Ron Chernow who wrote a biography of Grant, and someone asked him, Grant wrote a lengthy autobiography. It's like 330,000 words, right before he died. And so the guy said, well, how do you write a biography of somebody who wrote a good autobiography? And Chernow said, wow, that's a tough question. So he had to sort of develop a thesis. What am I trying to do in this book that is going to be engaging? You already have it right from the horse's mouth if you read the autobiography. So there has to be something else, And so he explains he had this idea of how he wanted to express it, what he wanted to tell people about it. So that's the important thing. If you don't have that, you're stumbling along.
I love that. What's one thing that people are generally surprised to find out about you?
I think a lot of people are surprised to find out how much fun I have, because I'm a very scholarly person, and I'm a very, what you might say, reserved person. But when people get to know me, they find out that, I'm very interested in humor, comedy, and expressing things in an amusing way. Not like the Three Stooges, more like Groucho Marx, or George Burns, where you have kind of a wry, insightful way of putting things that people hadn't thought of that makes them laugh. So that's a surprise to quite a few people. A lot of people never find out about that from me, but then the people who do get to know me realize after a while that I'm sort of like a scholarly comedian.
I love that. I do. Is there anything else you would like to say or add?
Well, I'd like to say that the data in this book are vital to every human being and can help you to achieve your goals faster and easier by explaining what might otherwise seem to be uh, inexplicable or random. Many of the things about human beings are not inexplicable and are not random, although that's how most people perceive them. People say, well, you can't predict. Yes, you can. If you have the data in this book, you can predict. You can know where things are going with a person. So to tell you the truth, when you're talking about anything related to human beings, I'm rarely surprised by anyone or anything. I know what they're doing. I know what they're about. I know what they're going to say before they say it, and so forth. Now, of course, if you're talking about natural phenomena like hurricanes, well, no, that's a different thing. But, like studying physical science, which I did to a great degree in my youth, you understand, you can predict chemically or electronically what's going to happen in the physical realm. Well, this book is doing that in the human realm. It's taking human phenomena. Notice I don't say human behavior because this is much bigger than human behavior. For example, there's a scale of civilization, which tells you how civilizations evolve and how a person's affinity to those levels tells you a lot about the person. And you can look at the whole civilization and evaluate it. So that's similar to what, in a vein to what Oswald Spengler was writing about 100 years ago. But this makes it very easy for people to improve themselves. And I put a lot of trouble into making this digestible and comprehensible to now people who don't want to improve themselves. They're not going to get it. They're not going to read the book. They're not going to want to read the book. If they do read the book, they're not going to understand it. And even if they did understand it, they wouldn't use it. But people like you would read it, would get it, and would use it. It's so user friendly. Look, think of it this way. It's like signage on the road. You go out on the road with your car, right? There's dotted lines in the middle, right? Or there's solid lines. That tells you something. You can't just go over that line, okay? There's all kinds of signs. There's lights, okay? You have to know that. That's why you have to take a test to get a driver's license. Well, this book is like the road signage, but it's for human phenomena. Tells you where to make a left turn, when you can go, when you should not go, who to avoid, who to go near, and so forth. How to get where you want to go. It's really what it's about.
I love that. It sounds like a roadmap to bettering yourself.
Yes.
Where's the best place for readers to find your book? I know a lot of readers love signed copies. Is that an option? And the best place that they can connect with you?
Okay. If you go to my website, septemics.com, that's Septemics, you will find people who are selling the book. Of course, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. It's an easy book to find. If you just type Septemics into a search engine, you'll get hundreds of responses. You'll get all kinds of stuff, reviews, videos, people selling the book. So it's easy to find. And as far as contacting me, my contact information is on the website. And in fact, there's a whole little section that explains if you want an autographed copy, how to get it. You just, it tells you very specifically what address, how much to send, And I do that occasionally. People ask and they'll Zelle me some money. My Zelle address is the same email address that's on the website. So just, and I'll autograph it and send it to you wherever you are.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate all the knowledge that you've given.
Thank you, Courtney. It was a pleasure talking to you.